So we have covered 4 different types of transformations that we can make with our standard sine curve or cosine curve. All right, we can adjust the amplitude, which is the height, the frequency, which either stretches those waves out or makes them closer together. We can shift the graph either horizontally or vertically. All right, so this document, just like it sounds, is putting all of these transformations together. So let's go through some of this together, and then the rest of this is going to be homework. So A, right, what does A stand for? That is the amplitude. And what does that tell me? Okay, so that tells me that it's telling me how high above or below the midline that my graph will be. Okay. B is known as the frequency. Right? And the frequency tells me how many cycles I will get in 2 pi units of length. Okay? And the period of the function, which I might as well go down here, the period is 2 pi divided by the frequency. Okay, so in this case, B. All right, sometimes I've seen the frequency called K. I think Kirk on his video might have had it called B. So, you know, it can have different letters to represent it. And what this means is that I get 1 complete cycle in, I'm going to write that with my pencil because I can't really type it. All right, so I get 1 complete cycle of my curve. I suppose I could have had the words of my curve in 2 pi divided by B units. So that's the length it takes to get me. The period is the length of time it takes me to get 1 complete cycle. Okay, back over here, then what is C? All right, and so when I do something to the X, just like we compared it back to the transformations we had done earlier in the semester with functions like y equals x squared, right? When I do something in the parentheses there to the X, that is a horizontal shift. Okay, and this is also called the phase shift, and it tells me the length of the horizontal shift. All right, and then D is the vertical shift. And tells me how many units to shift my graph vertically. Okay, and then the range of the graph. Okay, so the amplitude, if I have an amplitude of say 2, right, and that means that my range of the graph is -2 to +2. Okay. But if I add something in, like a +5, do that in a different color to contrast it. If I add a +5, that means I take my entire graph and I shift it up 5. Okay, so then that changes my range, right? I go up 5 from my lowest point, which would take me to 3, and up 5 from my highest point, which would take me to 7. So for me to generalize that, the range of the function is -2 A, because that would be my lowest point without a vertical shift, but then I have to add my vertical shift to it. And then the other end point would be, A would normally be my highest point, but then I add the vertical shift to it. All right, so this is my general formula for finding the range. And you're going to notice that I ask you down below here what the domain is. It makes no difference, all this crazy stuff that I do to my sine and cosine. No matter what types of transformations I use, my domain never changes. Okay, so for sine and for cosine, no matter what I do, my domain is all reals. Okay, but I put that question on here to highlight that. A couple things of importance. Notice there is a difference between the use of parentheses here. Okay, so I am going to write everything in this format so that we follow the directions that I just gave up here. It is different though if I have the bx minus c, then I would have to factor a b out. And if I factor a b out to get it in this form on the left, I would have to divide c by b also, all right, to factor the b out so that it looks like what I have on the left. So just be warned, I'm not going to give you any trick questions though, where I try to write it in that slightly different form and try to confuse you. So anyway, couple things that I want to talk about. So in this question, I'm asking you for the range. So we have a formula for that. That's not too hard. The period, right? So the period is 2 pi divided by the frequency. The period is never affected by the amplitude, right, or the vertical shift. Okay, so none of those things change the period. Okay, so if I wanted to know the period of, say, the graph in number 3, in number 3, doesn't matter that I've shifted it to this would actually shift to the left, pi over 4 units. Doesn't matter, right? I have a frequency, so letter D here would be 2. I have a frequency of 2, which means that my period would be 2 pi divided by 2. Okay, that is unaffected by having some vertical shift. Okay, the period and frequency are also unaffected by, I'm sorry, I said a vertical shift over here. I meant horizontal shift. The period and frequency are unaffected by having a horizontal shift, which I have in 3. The period and frequency are also unaffected, though, by a vertical shift and also by a change in amplitude. Okay, so again, in this case, frequency here would be the 0.1. Okay, it's not affected by the fact that this cosine curve has an amplitude of 2, and then it would be shifted down. Every point would be shifted down 3 units here. So let's do one of these together. So let's actually do number 7, the most difficult problem on here. So again, for A asks for the domain, which is all reals. Okay, domain is unaffected by any of the crazy stuff that I'm doing here. All right, letter B then asks me for the range. Now, if I didn't have this 1 here, okay, the range of 3 cosine x would just be -3 to +3. Okay, if I simply had 3 cosine x, that would be the range right here. But I take this and I shift it up 1. All right, so that means I need to add a 1 to both endpoints, right? Because the entire graph goes up 1 unit. Okay, and then my period and frequency. So I put period first. It might make a little more sense to look at your frequency first because we need the frequency to figure out the period. All right, and so the frequency is right here, that 2. Okay, again, my frequency and my period are unaffected by the fact that I am shifting this graph pi over 2 units to the right. This would be a shift to the right. Okay, pi over 2 units. But I'm still going to get 2 curves within 0 to 2 pi. All right, that's what the frequency means. I get 2 cosine curves between 0 and 2 pi. Well, if I get 2 curves between 0 and 2 pi, that means I get 1 curve, right? So I'm following the formula, but I'm also following common sense, right? If I get 2 curves between 0 and 2 pi, then I get 1 curve in pi units. From 0 to pi, I would get 1 unit. So even though my graph has been shifted, when I ask you for the period, that's the length of the interval. Okay, so even though I shift the graph to the left or to the right, the length of the interval is still pi units, right? From wherever I start to wherever I have the end of my complete cycle, that would be pi units. And then the amplitude, that's the last thing I have to answer. So the amplitude in this case is 3. Okay, so other things on this homework assignment, little compare and contrast kind of thing, right? Where I have all different variations here and you have to tell what does what. So some matching in number 9. And then I'm going to have you graph, by the end of this, you will have graphed this complicated looking beast of a function. All right, but we're going to do that step by step by step. Okay, so by the end, you're graphing this, but you're going to start by just graphing first y equals cosine of half x, right? Instead of using your calculator, I had said use this graph. So if this is x, make this column half x. Right? And maybe just like I did in the notes, maybe we only focus on this part. Okay, and then find cosine of half x, just like I had done in the notes. Okay, you're going to graph that first, and then in the next graph, you're going to take the graph that you did in number 10, and you're going to increase the amplitude to 3. All right, graph that. Then after you've graphed that, then add this vertical shift of 1 unit. So that means take the graph that you did in 11, shift it up 1 unit. And then by the time we get to 13, take the graph you have above, and this shifts pi over 2 units, and it's positive, so it's going to shift to the left. Okay, so the rest is homework.